They erased me from every family photo, every story, every memory, until the day they won a once-in-a-lifetime trip. They didn't know the prize was built by the daughter they disowned. When the helicopter door opened in front of them, I didn't say a word. I just smiled. Revenge doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just lands quietly on a helipad. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The sunlight over Dubai always looks heavier in the late afternoon, as if the heat itself is made of gold. I stood by the glass wall of my suite on the 75th floor of the Burj Al Arab. The city sprawled below me in neat, shimmering lines. The air inside was cool, silent, the kind of silence I'd spent 12 years learning to live with. 12 years since I'd walked out of my family's house in Newport Beach. 12 years since anyone there had spoken my name out loud. They called it exile. I called it breathing. I watched the Arabian Gulf catch the light, each wave like a memory rising and fading before it reached the shore. Tomorrow, Aurora Sky Dome would open its doors, a resort that carried my signature, my vision, my name. For years, my father's name had been the only one that mattered in Southern California real estate. Richard Hale. The man who built towers and broke people with the same ease. I used to think silence was weakness, that walking away meant surrender. I know better now. It was 2010, the night it all cracked. I can still smell the salt air coming through the windows of the dining room, the faint burn of his scotch. We were halfway through dinner when he looked up from his tablet and said, "You'll start at Hale Development after graduation. We'll find you something suitable, marketing maybe." His tone wasn't a suggestion. It never was. I remember setting down my fork. "I'm not joining the company, Dad." The room froze. My mother, Margaret, kept her eyes on her glass of wine. My sister Vanessa pressed her lips together, pretending to text. My father laughed once, short and sharp. "Don't be ridiculous. You've been preparing for this your entire life. I've been preparing for yours," I said quietly. "Not mine." His face turned red, that shade that meant danger. "You think you can do better on your own out there?" "You have no idea how this world works. I'll learn." He slammed his hand on the table. "You'll fail. And when you do, don't come back here asking for help." My mother's voice trembled. "Richard, please." "No." He looked at me like I was a stranger. "From this moment, you're on your own. You're not part of Hale Development. You're not part of this family's legacy." The clatter of silverware was the only sound after that. I remember standing up slowly, feeling every eye in the room follow me. My mother whispered, "Don't make him angrier," as if anger was something sacred she couldn't afford to offend. I wanted her to stop me to say something kind, but she just turned her head. It was raining when I left. Newport rain, the kind that makes the streets shine like mirrors. I packed one suitcase, shoved in my unfinished Stanford ID, and walked out of the house without looking back. I waited in the driveway for a minute, hoping for a voice behind me, a door opening. Nothing. Only the sound of the ocean, endless and indifferent. I told myself I'd never return, until the silence between us was louder than his voice. The years that followed were not kind. Cheap apartments, double shifts. 1,000 polite smiles that didn't reach my eyes. But I kept going. Every morning before sunrise, I wrote the same line on a piece of paper and stuck it to my wall. "Make the noise they can't ignore." Now, standing in Dubai, I could almost hear that line echo through the glass. The city below was everything Newport wasn't. Open, ambitious, unapologetic. The horizon burned orange, fading into violet as night crept up the skyline. I checked the calendar on my phone, Friday, April 25th. The grand opening, my company's name, Hale Global Resorts, lit up in white letters at the top of the agenda. A knock on the door pulled me back. Jason Moore, my COO, stepped in holding a stack of schedules. "Everything's confirmed for tomorrow," he said. "Press arrivals, VIP guest list, the helicopter route. You'll make quite an entrance." "I'm sure I will," I said, watching the last of the lights sink behind the towers. He paused. "You okay?" I nodded, just remembering where silence started. Jason hesitated, then left me to it. The door closed with a soft click, and I was alone again. I looked down at the city one more time, tracing the shape of its streets, the way they curved like veins of light. Somewhere inside me, the young woman who left home in the rain was still walking suitcase in hand, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Tomorrow, when the cameras flashed and the speeches began, I'd smile the way my father taught me to. But the meaning would be mine. Silence had never been surrender. It was preparation. Sometimes walking away isn't giving up. It's the sound your life makes when you finally step out of someone else's shadow. Los Angeles in 2011 smelled like salt and asphalt. My apartment sat at the back of a cracked building off Lincoln Boulevard, 1 block from a gas station that never closed. The walls sweated in summer paint peeling in soft curls. Every morning at 5, the garbage truck slammed its way down the alley and shook the windows like a bad memory trying to get in. I'd roll out of bed, pull my hair into a ponytail, and stare at the schedule taped to the fridge. 6 shifts this week, 1 day off, if no one called in sick. The ink had bled from the humidity. The hotel was a 3-story box 2 blocks from the Santa Monica Pier. From the lobby, you could hear the ocean, but never see it. My uniform was a beige blazer that didn't fit, and shoes that chewed at my heels. I spent the first hour of every shift wiping down the counter and practicing the kind of smile that looked real enough to earn tips. By 7, the tourists arrived. Families smelling of sunscreen, businessmen already on their phones, the occasional celebrity pretending not to be one. That morning, the elevator jammed again. I ran upstairs with a screwdriver, pried the door open, and coaxed a family of 5 out with free breakfast vouchers. The manager called it guest engagement. I called it survival. When I finally got back to the front desk, a man in a linen shirt was pounding on the counter. "I've been waiting 20 minutes for my room," he snapped. "Do you people not understand customer service?" I took a slow breath, felt the burn of exhaustion behind my ribs. "I completely understand, sir," I said, fingers tapping the keyboard. "Let me upgrade you to an ocean view complimentary for the delay." His anger leaked out like air from a balloon. "Fine," he muttered, snatching the keycard. When he turned away, I noticed a woman sitting near the lobby window. Gray hair pulled into a neat bun navy suit, pressed sharp enough to cut glass. She watched me the way some people watch a chess game, seeing moves before they're made. "You handled that well," she said as I passed. Her voice carried quiet authority. "Are you a manager here?" I shook my head. "Just front desk, hospitality student, survival student," I said, before I could stop myself. She smiled. "That's the best kind." Her name was Eleanor Brooks. She handed me a white card with embossed letters, Brooks Investments. "If you ever want a chance to do something bigger, call me." That night, I laid the card on my nightstand and stared at it until the light from the gas station flickered across its surface. I'd seen people like her before. Rich, curious, generous for a moment, and forgetful the next. I tucked it into a drawer, told myself not to believe in miracles. A year passed. Same uniform, same lobby, different faces. I saved every dollar in a jar labeled someday. On good nights, I'd fall asleep to the sound of the ocean beyond the highway, imagining what bigger might look like. Then, one Thursday morning in 2012, the phone behind the desk rang. "Madison Hale," a familiar voice asked. "This is Eleanor Brooks. I was in your lobby last year. Still surviving." "Barely," I said, half laughing. "I have a project you might want to see. Palm Desert. Small property, big potential. Be at Cafe Toscana tomorrow at 10. The next day I borrowed a blazer from a coworker and took a bus across town. The cafe smelled like espresso and ambition. Eleanor was already there, a folder waiting beside her coffee. "I buy places that shouldn't work and make them work," she said. "This one needs someone who understands effort isn't the same as talent. I think that's you." Inside the folder were photos of a sun-bleached motel near Palm Springs. $200,000 to renovate. I'll fund it. You'll run it. We split profits. If it fails, I take the loss. I laughed softly. "You're serious, completely." She sipped her coffee. "All I want in return is your word you'll never call yourself lucky." I signed before I let myself think about it. The desert hit me like a furnace the first day I arrived. The property was worse than the pictures. Cracked pool tiles, broken doors, sand piled against the walls. I stayed anyway. For months, I painted, scrubbed, bargained with contractors, and learned how to stretch a dollar until it begged for mercy. Eleanor visited once a week, bringing iced tea and advice that sounded like riddles. By winter, the rooms were open, the neon sign flickered back to life, and our first guests checked in, when the accountant called to say we'd actually turned a profit. I sat on the curb outside, dust covering my jeans, and laughed until I cried. I didn't own much, one car that barely ran a savings account with 4 digits, but I owned my days. For the first time since Newport, I wasn't defined by the family I'd left behind. Late one night, I flipped on the TV for background noise. My father's face filled the screen, still sharp, still certain. A family's legacy, he told the interviewer, is built by those who understand discipline and loyalty. I turned up the volume, listening to the familiar cadence of control. Then I smiled to myself almost kindly. One day I thought he'll understand what legacy really means. By 2018, Hale Global had grown into something I could barely recognize. The glass tower in downtown Los Angeles caught the morning light like a mirror angled toward the sky. And sometimes when I walked through the lobby, I saw my reflection layered over the company's logo and thought, this is what rebuilding looks like. The office smelled like fresh coffee and ambition. People greeted me with that mix of respect and curiosity reserved for someone who'd done the impossible and survived it. Jason Moore, my COO, met me outside the conference room with a folder tucked under his arm. He's here, he said, lowering his voice slightly. Daniel Pierce, the new CFO candidate. You'll like him. Stanford MBA top 10 under 35 in Forbes. A little too slick for my taste, but solid numbers. The man waiting inside stood as I entered. Tailored gray suit, easy smile, the kind of confidence that fills space before he even speaks. Ms. Hale, he said, extending his hand. It's an honor. You built this empire from nothing. That's rare these days. Nothing makes you appreciate structure like watching it collapse, I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, maybe too firm, the kind of handshake meant to measure rather than greet. We sat across from each other as Jason reviewed his proposal. Daniel laid out his ideas for expanding into the Middle East. Dubai. Abu Dhabi, Doha, complete with charts, numbers, and market projections. It's the future, he said, pointer. Gliding across the screen. Tourism. There is growing exponentially. You could triple revenue in 5 years. I studied him while he talked. The data was sharp, the presentation flawless, but it was his eyes that caught me. Steady, calculating, a mirror of the ambition I used to see in my father. You've done your homework, I said. Let's explore it. You'll take point on research. Jason gave me a look that said, careful. I ignored it. I'd learned to trust talent even when it came wrapped in arrogance. Over the next few months, Daniel settled in quickly. He was efficient, charismatic, the kind of executive who remembered everyone's birthday and never missed an opportunity to charm investors. The staff adored him. Jason tolerated him. I watched him. One Friday night, the company hosted a cocktail mixer at a downtown rooftop bar, the kind of event that looked effortless and cost more than I used to make in a year. I arrived late, found Jason nursing a whiskey by the railing. You're missing the schmooze fest, I teased. I'm missing the noise, he said. Look over there. Across the room, Daniel stood with a man I hadn't seen in over a decade, Richard Hale, my father. Even from a distance, that posture was unmistakable. Shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly, as if gravity owed him something. My breath caught for half a second before settling into a slow burn. What the hell is he doing here? I asked quietly. Jason frowned. I don't know. He's on the guest list as a potential investor. Must have slipped through the PR team. Daniel raised his glass toward me, unaware I'd noticed them. My father smiled, a thin, polite curve of control, and handed him a business card. They spoke for a few minutes, then shook hands, a simple gesture that rewrote the air around them. I left without saying goodbye. The next Monday, Daniel was all charm again, presenting financial updates like nothing had happened. If he noticed my silence, he didn't show it. That week, a few documents went missing from the accounting drive. Jason mentioned it over lunch, casual, but wary. Probably just an upload glitch, he said. I nodded, pretending not to feel the familiar tightening in my chest. A month later, an anonymous leak hit the trade blogs, a rumor that Hale Global's next expansion was funded by legacy money from Newport Beach, my father's money. It wasn't true, but it was enough to plant doubt. Jason brought it up in my office. I'm not saying it's him, but Pierce has been spending a lot of time outside the office after hours. Proof, I asked. None yet. Then we wait. That night I stayed late reviewing financial reports long after everyone had gone home. The city glowed through the glass like a field of distant fires. Around midnight, I went to refill my coffee and caught a movement on the security monitor. Daniel leaving the building through the back entrance laptop bag slung over his shoulder. The timestamp blinked 12:07 a.m. I watched the screen for a long time, the quiet hum of the server room filling the space between my thoughts. I could confront him. I could fire him tomorrow, but instinct told me to hold. to see what kind of man he became when he thought no one was watching. Sometimes the enemy doesn't need to break in. They just need to wear a suit and smile at the right time. The desert light in Dubai had a way of blinding you even through tinted glass. I pressed my forehead against the airplane window as the city came into view, steel sand and ambition rising straight out of the heat. Beside me, David Kahn was already reviewing the investment brief for Aurora Skydome. His pen tapped against the armrest in a rhythm that matched the hum of the engines. "First time in Dubai," he asked without looking up. I nodded. "First time in a place that doesn't apologize for wanting everything." He smiled, half impressed, half amused. "That's one way to describe it. Just remember, this market doesn't forgive mistakes. Every deal here comes with teeth." I watched the skyline sharpen through the haze. "I've lived with mistakes for 10 years," I said. "I've learned how to make them work for me." When we landed, the air hit like a wall. Dry, heavy, alive. The drive from the airport to the construction site felt like moving through a mirage. Cranes rose in the distance like metallic skeletons. At the center of it all, the frame of Aurora Skydome curved toward the skyglass, and steel catching the light until it hurt to look. Workers in yellow helmets moved like clockwork. The place buzzed with precision and promise. David wiped sweat from his temple. "It's bold," he said, "almost too bold." "That's the point," I replied. "People don't remember modest skylines." We toured the grounds with the project director listening to talk of schedules, materials, permits, all the ordinary chaos that builds something extraordinary. But I couldn't stop staring at the reflection of the sun on the half-finished dome. It looked like a second sunrise, mine maybe. That night I met with investors at the Armani Hotel in Burj Khalifa. Everything there gleamed: marble floors, mirrored walls, chandeliers that dripped light instead of glass. Eleanor Brooks had sent a video message for the occasion. Her voice filled the conference room as her face appeared on the screen framed by her Manhattan office. "I'm proud of you, Madison," she said. "You built something that doesn't need anyone's approval to exist. Remember, the higher you go, the fewer people can follow. Don't look down." The screen went black. The silence that followed felt like a benediction. The contracts were spread out before me, page after page of numbers and clauses that could make or break a future. The Hale Global logo gleamed faintly at the top corner, the same name that once closed every door I tried to open. My father had always said the Hale name was a currency. "Spend it wisely or it'll bankrupt you." I touched the logo lightly with my fingertip and whispered, "I'll carve it into something you can't erase." I signed the final page. 2 days later, Jason called from Los Angeles. "Congrats on the deal," he said, then hesitated. "But there's something off in the investment breakdown." "What kind of off?" I asked, walking toward the window, looking down at the pool, far below Lua's melted glass. "There's a minor equity group, Everbright Holdings. They've been buying small percentages through different subsidiaries." I traced one of them back to a familiar address in Newport Beach. My chest tightened. My father looks like it. I stared at the city lights, each one a reminder that no distance is far enough when someone's determined to follow. "How much?" "4 million total. We can bury it if you want. No one would know." For a long moment I didn't answer. I thought of all the years I'd spent clawing out from under that name, only to find it crawling back into my ledger. "Sell it," I said, finally. "All of it. Today." Jason's voice sharpened. "Madison, that's a loss. I don't care. Freedom costs more than that." There was a pause on the line, then a quiet exhale. "Understood." After I hung up, I sat in the dark, the city outside, flickering like a restless heart. I imagined my father hearing the news that I'd just erased his shadow from my project, that his money wasn't welcome in my empire. He'd call it pride. He'd be wrong. When you cut a cord that once held you, pain is inevitable. It pulls, it burns, it leaves a mark, but pain is proof you're no longer bound. That night, as the desert wind pressed against the glass, I felt it. Something between loss and liberation. I closed my eyes and let it settle. Some ties aren't meant to be untangled gently. Some have to be severed so you can finally move, without dragging the weight of someone else's name behind you. The morning light slanted through the glass walls of the marketing floor, turning the air gold. March in Los Angeles always felt like the city was trying to start over. Bright, restless, almost too clean. I sat at the end of the long table while the marketing team clicked through slides for our next campaign. The projector hummed, flashing the words "Skyline Experience Giveaway" across the screen in Hale Global Blue. "It's our biggest customer engagement to date," the director said. 10 all-inclusive luxury trips to Aurora Sky Dome for our loyalty members. Media coverage influencer tie-ins, a live drawing on social. We're expecting record traction. Jason leaned toward me. Simple, glamorous. Everyone loves free vacations. I nodded, barely listening, scrolling through upcoming launch events on my tablet. It was a slow, calm morning, the kind that gives you the illusion you're safe, until Jason returned an hour later with a folder in his hand. Winner's list just came in, he said. Want to do the honors? I took the papers, scanning the first few names without much interest. Corporate partners, longtime members, predictable VIPs. Until my eyes caught on 3 lines near the bottom. Richard Hale, Margaret Hale, Vanessa Hale. For a second, the room went out of focus. My fingers tightened on the page, the sound of the air conditioning turning sharp and distant. Jason must have seen my face because his tone softened. It's random. Third-party software. We can replace them, no one will know. I looked up at him. No, I said quietly. Keep it. He frowned. Madison, I said keep it. Let them come. He hesitated, studying me, as if he were trying to decide whether this was strategy or madness. You sure you want them in your world again? On your turf. I don't need to want it. I said, I just need it to happen. He nodded slowly, slid the list back into the folder, and left without another word. I sat alone for a while, staring at their names. 12 years of distance, of silence and rebuilding, and still the universe found a way to weave us together again. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. Or maybe it was just punctual. That evening, I watched the first promotional ads go live on social. Footage of the resort glowed on screen. Desert sunsets, glass domes catching light, guests laughing beside turquoise pools. The tagline read, "Where the sky meets your story." For the Hales, it would meet theirs in a way they could never imagine. Across the ocean in Newport Beach, I could almost picture the moment they opened the invitation. My father's office, overlooking the harbor, the same one I hadn't stepped into since I was 23. The envelope would have carried the Hale Global seal embossed in silver, the one he used to say was a wannabe imitation of real class. I could hear him now. Well, look at that, he'd say to Margaret, holding the letter at arm's length like a trophy. Finally a company with some taste. And my mother, ever gracious, would laugh softly. Truly fitting, don't you think, a Hale family on a Hale resort? Coincidence has good manners. Vanessa would probably roll her eyes and post the ticket on her Instagram story with a caption about luxury travel and manifesting success. The irony would be almost beautiful. While they celebrated their stroke of luck, I began planning the event schedule. Every second of their stay would be choreographed: the arrival at Dubai International, the limousine transfer to Aurora Sky Dome, the welcome dinner under the glass dome. My team didn't know the reason for my precision. Jason did. You could tell them ahead of time, he said one night, as we finalized the guest logistics. Prepare them. That's what decent people do. Then it wouldn't be poetic, I replied. He shook his head. You don't believe in poetry. You believe in control. Same thing, I said, smiling faintly. In truth, it wasn't revenge I felt building. It was symmetry. The way the world quietly folds back on itself to show you what was always waiting. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't even need to speak. Presence would do the work. As the departure date approached, the office buzzed with excitement. PR teams rehearsed press lines, event planners double-checked seating charts, and I reviewed the helicopter manifest one last time. My name sat at the top. Theirs a few lines below, listed as honored guests. Karma never sends a letter of warning. It just arrives on schedule. 2 weeks later, Jason texted me from the operations desk at Dubai International. They've landed. I stood at the balcony of my suite, watching the horizon shimmer in the morning heat. Somewhere beyond the terminals, my family was stepping off a plane, tasting the air of a city that didn't need them. I could imagine Margaret adjusting her sunglasses, admiring the private transfer waiting by the curb. This, she would say, slipping her arm through Richard's, is what class feels like. And Richard would smile, that same sharp, satisfied smile. Of course it is, he'd reply. It's the kind of place that knows who belongs. The sun glinted off the glass towers, the desert wind humming low against the windows. I whispered to no one. You're right, Dad. It does. The sky above the desert was already blinding by 9 a.m. A sheet of light so sharp it made the glass dome of Aurora Sky Dome glow like liquid gold. From the helipad, I could see the entire coastline, stretching out toward the horizon, where the air shimmered with heat and salt. Down below, the event was in full motion. Reporters, executives, influencers. The kind of crowd that smelled like money and curiosity. Music pulsed from hidden speakers, steady and deliberate, as if it were timed to my heartbeat. The helicopter door was open, and the wind whipped around me, tugging at my hair. My clothes, every trace of hesitation I still had. The pilot gave a thumbs up. From above, I caught flashes of color. Silk dresses, champagne glasses, the gleam of cameras. A sea of strangers waiting to applaud what they thought was just another business launch. They didn't know they were about to watch a resurrection. T-2 minutes, the pilot said through the headset. I adjusted the collar of my white jumpsuit, smooth and structured, the kind of fabric that doesn't wrinkle, no matter how much the world around you shakes. My reflection in the window was calm, controlled. Exactly how I'd spent the last 12 years building myself to be. Below, the MC's voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the sky, above the Aurora Sky Dome. I stepped forward, one hand on the handle, feeling the tremor of the blades vibrating through my bones. The door opened fully. A gust of hot air slammed against my face. I smiled. The silver helicopter descended slowly, hovering over the landing pad. The crowd gasped as the downdraft scattered napkins and scarves. A line of photographers jostled for position. The pilot touched down with perfect precision, and the world seemed to hold its breath. When the door slid open, I took the first step into the sunlight. For a heartbeat, everything went quiet. No music, no voices, just the wind. Then the flashes started blinding and rhythmic, like lightning striking over and over. I heard the MC announce my name clear and proud. Please welcome the CEO of Hale Global Resorts, Madison Hale. 12 years ago, they erased my name from every invitation list, every conversation that mattered. Today, it was written across the sky, in gold. I descended the steps slowly, the heat rising from the pad, each click of my heel deliberate, echoing against the metal. My hair whipped across my cheek, but I didn't flinch. When I reached the ground, I looked straight ahead, never down. Beyond the velvet ropes, my father stood in a linen suit, glass of champagne frozen halfway to his mouth. My mother beside him, her pearls catching the light lips parted in disbelief. Vanessa stood just behind them, her smile faltering, eyes widening as if she'd seen a ghost. For a moment, none of them moved. I met their eyes. No anger, no triumph, just recognition. Margaret's glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor. The sound was swallowed by applause. The MC kept talking, his words blending into the hum of the crowd, but all I could hear was the silence between us. The same silence that had started in a dining room in Newport Beach and followed me across every ocean. My father's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the back of a chair until his knuckles went white. He didn't look away. Jason was waiting at the base of the stairs, clipboard in hand, pretending not to watch. When I reached him, he whispered, "They didn't see it coming. That was the idea." I said softly. We walked toward the main entrance as photographers shouted my name. The resort sparkled under the morning sun, glass walls curving upward like waves, light spilling through every edge. My team had spent 3 years perfecting every inch of it, but standing there now, it felt like more than a building. It felt like a statement carved out of air and steel. Inside, the marble floor gleamed like still water. I paused near the reception desk where a sleek silver plaque waited on an easel. Aurora Sky Dome, grand opening. A pen lay beside it. I signed my name in black ink, the letters bold and steady. My hand didn't shake. When I looked up, the photographers were still snapping, the applause still rolling. But through the glass doors behind them, I could see my family, still standing where I'd left them, frozen, trying to process the impossible. My mother whispered something I couldn't hear. My sister reached out, touching her arm. My father just stood there, eyes locked on mine across the distance. For a fraction of a second, I saw something unfamiliar in his face. Not rage, not pride, but something raw. Something that almost looked like understanding. I turned away before it could mean anything. The crowd inside surged forward, offering congratulations, hands, cameras, questions. I smiled, nodded, posed when needed. Every movement practiced, measured. But somewhere beneath it all, my pulse beat steady and calm. Sometimes silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's power, waiting for the right moment to make itself heard. As I walked into the main hall, the glass doors closed behind me with a soft hiss. Outside, the applause echoed like distant thunder. Inside, the air smelled of jasmine and champagne. I signed one last guest book, then let my hand fall to my side. Behind me, my name shone across the screen above the stage. Hale in silver letters 10 feet tall. For the first time, it didn't belong to anyone but me. The video had been up for less than 12 hours when the world decided it knew who I was. Every social feed I opened was the same. Clips of me stepping off the helicopter, my hair catching the wind, that half smile frozen in high definition. Someone had slowed the footage down, added cinematic music, and tagged it with #helicopterheiress. My name was trending above a Senate hearing and a celebrity divorce. The internet loved a comeback, especially one wrapped in diamonds and mystery. I sat cross-legged on the couch of my hotel suite, the laptop balanced on my knees, screen glowing with 20 open tabs. Headlines scrolled past. From family outcast to global mogul. Who is Madison Hale? Really the woman who landed above her past? Every one of them felt like a story about someone I used to know. Jason knocked once before stepping inside, phone still pressed to his ear. He hung up and leaned against the wall, shaking his head. You officially broke the internet. Every network from New York to Tokyo wants an interview. Even late-night talk shows are calling. Good, I said. It's about time they remembered the name they tried to delete. He raised an eyebrow. You sound calm for someone who just became a global headline. I've been invisible before, I said, closing the laptop. This time they'll have to look. Jason studied me for a second. You know what's coming, right? People dig. They always do. Let them, I said. I have nothing to hide. He didn't argue, just sighed and left to deal with another flood of press calls. When the door clicked shut, the room was quiet, except for the hum of the city below. I leaned back, letting the silence settle in. 12 years of being erased had taught me how to live with quiet, how to turn it into armor. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, my past was already writing its rebuttal. In Newport Beach, my father sat in his office surrounded by old trophies and thicker air. The TV played the same clip over and over. Me stepping down from the helicopter. Next to him, Daniel Pierce poured a drink and handed it over like an offering. This is perfect, Daniel said, eyes fixed on the screen. Everyone's looking at her. If we time it right, we can show them who she really is, my father smirked. She thinks she's untouchable now. Success makes people sloppy. She owes her name, her reputation. Everything to me. Let's remind her where it came from. They clinked glasses. Somewhere inside that room, the plan was already forming. An alliance of spite dressed up as righteousness. Back in Dubai, my phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with Marcus Lang's name. I answered on the second ring. Madison, he said without preamble. We need a statement. Something short. Something that frames this narrative before it spins out of control. They're already calling you the helicopter heiress with a secret. I smiled faintly. A secret sells better than the truth. Let them have it. Silence isn't a strategy this time, Marcus warned. You need to say something. I walked to the window, watching the city glitter below. Silence is exactly what they taught me, I said. I'm just giving it back. There was a pause. You sure I've never been more sure? When I hung up, I caught my reflection in the glass, tired but steady. Outside, the Dubai skyline pulsed with light, 1,000 eyes blinking in unison. I'd spent years chasing this kind of visibility, but now that I had it, it felt almost hollow. The applause, the headlines, the flashing cameras, none of it filled the space that silence left behind. I poured myself a drink, sat back on the couch, and thought about what it cost to be seen. The version of me the world loved was polished, unbreakable, cinematic. The real me still woke up some nights hearing my father's voice telling me I'd fail. Maybe both versions were true. By midnight, the laptop screen glowed again, the constant stream of notifications slowing to a steady rhythm. My eyelids were heavy when the email arrived. No subject line, no sender name I recognized. Just one phrase in the preview bar. Confidential. Internal reports. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a series of attachments, financial summaries, internal audits, flagged transactions, documents only a handful of people in my company could access. At the bottom of the email, a single line of text, from an old acquaintance. My stomach tightened. I didn't need to read the metadata to know who sent it. Daniel Pierce had always been the kind of man who smiled as he set the trap. I stared at the screen until the cursor blinked like a heartbeat, the words blurring slightly. So this was how they wanted to play it. I closed the laptop slowly, every motion deliberate. The city outside was still alive, but I could feel the shift, the faint vibration of a storm beginning to form. They wanted noise. They wanted a spectacle. But noise was their weapon, not mine. Sometimes the loudest answer you can give is the quiet you choose to keep. Morning came wrapped in the static of headlines. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications, news alerts, messages from journalists who suddenly remembered my number. When I finally opened one of the articles, the headline filled the screen like a slap. Madison Hale, the heiress who built her empire on family money. Every outlet ran a version of it, complete with side-by-side photos of me in Dubai and my father at a podium in Newport Beach. The clip played automatically. My father stood behind a row of microphones, calm and deliberate. "Our family has always valued hard work and integrity," he said. "I only hope my daughter remembers those values." I turned the sound off halfway through. Same tone, same sermon. He didn't have to raise his voice anymore. The world did it for him. By the time I reached the office, the air was already tense. Marcus was pacing in front of the conference room window. Jason scrolling through a tablet, and Evelyn Carter, our legal counsel, was flipping through a folder thick with printouts. Marcus didn't wait for me to sit. "This thing's blowing up. The networks are quoting your father word for word. If you stay quiet, they own the story. If you respond too late, you sound defensive. We need a statement. Something human, something controlled." Jason looked up. "Or we just ride it out. The internet moves fast. It'll die in a week." Marcus shot him a glare. "Unless someone keeps feeding it, which, judging by this leak, they will." Evelyn slid a document across the table. "The internal reports that went public last night didn't come from any of our systems. They were copied externally 6 months ago. I tracked the route. It went through a shell company in California. The address leads back to one of your father's holding firms." I felt the words before I processed them, a tight coil unspooling inside my chest. "He's laundering the leak through Daniel," I said. "That's why it looks internal." Evelyn nodded. "We can prove it, but we'll need time. And you'll need to decide whether to go public." Jason leaned forward. "Madison, this could spiral. He's turning your silence into confession." I folded my hands on the table, steadying my breath. "Then let him. Let him tell the story, the way he always does. When he's finished, I'll rewrite it in facts." Marcus groaned. "You're impossible." "Just patient," I said. The meeting dragged into the afternoon. PR drafts were written and scrapped. Evelyn coordinated the quiet investigation, digital forensics paper trails, offshore filings. Every so often I caught my reflection in the glass wall behind them, the Dubai skyline burning gold. The city felt alive like it was watching. When the sun started to dip, Marcus placed his phone on the table. "CNN Business wants a live interview tonight. 15 minutes. They'll lead with the controversy, but if you handle it right, it resets the tone." I thought about it for a long moment. Book it. The studio lights were colder than I expected. Across from me, the anchor smiled that practiced, predatory smile. "Ms. Hale, there are reports that your company's expansion was funded through inherited assets. How do you respond to those who say your success was built on family privilege?" I smiled back, calm. "I didn't inherit wealth." I said, "I inherited silence. My last name didn't buy me anything. It only reminded me what I had to build without help. If people call that privilege, they've never had to start over." He tried again. "And your father's comments, I respect his right to his version of the story," I said. "But the truth is simple. The Hale name didn't make my success. It's just the proof of what I've survived." When the cameras stopped rolling, the anchor shook my hand and said, "That'll trend." Back at the hotel, I kicked off my heels, poured a glass of water, and opened my laptop. A new email sat at the top of my inbox, from Evelyn. Subject line, urgent, SEC, notification. Inside one sentence, the Securities and Exchange Commission has opened an investigation into Richard Hale's financial activities and potential insider trading. For a long time, I just stared at the screen, the cursor blinking beside my father's name. The air felt heavier, the kind of silence that follows thunder before the rain. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The game had shifted again. I used to think betrayal only broke things. Now I know, it also lights up the map showing you who's really standing beside you. The news broke like a slow collapse, one headline at a time. On every channel, every feed, every stock ticker, the same story repeated itself. Richard Hale suspended from the board of Hale Development pending an SEC investigation. The man who once called himself the architect of California's skyline was now a headline framed in downfall. Inside his Newport Beach office, the television glowed over empty whiskey glasses and unfinished deals. He stood in the middle of the room, tie-loosened face pale under the fluorescent light. Reporters shouted his name from the street outside, the sound muffled but relentless. He turned the volume up just long enough to hear the words, "corporate misconduct," then hurled the glass at the wall. "It's all because of her," he shouted to no one. The whiskey soaked into the carpet, the smell mixing with dust and regret. The camera on the security desk caught him pacing like a caged animal, shouting half-sentences at invisible ghosts. By afternoon, the networks had already cut together the story, archival footage of his ribbon cuttings and magazine covers, followed by slow-motion shots of flashing cameras outside his office. The caption read, "The Fall of a Titan." Across the country, I sat in my Los Angeles office, the blinds open to a view of the city we both once claimed as ours. On my monitor, Hale Global's quarterly revenue graph arched upward untouched by scandal. Jason stood beside me, coffee in hand. "Karma doesn't rush," he said quietly. I smiled, watching the red line climb. But it always arrives on time. For the first time in months, the office felt light. The tension that had clung to every meeting, every phone call finally lifted. Outside, my team moved through their day like nothing had happened, because in truth, nothing had. To us, the empire that was crumbling belonged to someone else. Still, I knew this wasn't victory. It was gravity, the natural pull that comes for those who build too high on arrogance. That evening, the FBI raided a townhouse in Zurich. The footage aired on CNN before midnight agents in dark jackets leading a man out in handcuffs. Daniel Pierce. He kept his head down as the cameras flashed. The anchor's voice was almost gleeful. Former CFO of Hale Global Resorts, captured after attempting to flee the country, amid allegations of corporate espionage and securities fraud. I watched the clip once, then turned the TV off. When you choose the wrong side, sooner or later, you pay for it with the thing you tried to protect. Your freedom, your reputation, your name. The next morning, the front page of the Wall Street Journal carried the headline, "Hale Dynasty Falls. Empire Collapses Under Its Own Pride." The photo below it showed my father leaving his office surrounded by reporters, his face drawn and tired. He didn't look like the man who once ordered the world to bend to his will. He looked like someone realizing too late that the world had kept moving without him. Midday, another broadcast caught my mother outside their house, sunglasses on, voice trembling as she faced a wall of microphones. "My husband made mistakes," she said, "but he's not a bad man." Her words cracked halfway through. The reporters leaned closer. She wiped her eyes, the image freezing on every channel. I sat at my desk watching it unfold. For years I had imagined this moment would feel like redemption, like the scales finally balanced. But there was no satisfaction in it, only a quiet inevitability. Some failures don't need your push. They fall on their own because the foundation was built on pride. Jason knocked once and stepped in, holding his phone. "They're calling this the end of an era." "Every era ends," I said. "Some just end louder than others." He hesitated, then asked, "You going to reach out to her? To your mom?" "I don't think she wants to hear from me right now." He nodded, understanding more than he said, and left me alone with the silence. Outside, the light was fading, the skyline melting into evening haze. My inbox pinged. A new message, one line in the subject bar. "We need to talk," from Margaret Hale. I didn't open it. I just stared at the words until the screen dimmed. The sound of the city carried through the window, distant and low, and I let it fill the room. Some conversations could wait. Some needed silence before they could mean anything at all. It was late afternoon when the receptionist buzzed my line. "Ms. Hale, there's a woman here to see you. She says it's urgent." I almost said no. My schedule was packed, and my patience had been thin all week. But something in her tone made me ask, Name a pause. Margaret Hale. For a moment, I thought the phone had gone dead. My mother hadn't used her own last name with mine in over a decade. I told the receptionist to send her up. When the elevator doors opened, the air in my office seemed to still. She stood there in a beige coat, her posture perfect, but her face pale, worn. The years had softened her edges, but deepened her eyes lines, where pride and exhaustion had taken turns carving their signatures. In her hand was a cream-colored envelope. "Hello, Madison," she said quietly. "I didn't offer a handshake. You found me." She gave a small, nervous laugh. "It wasn't difficult. Your name's everywhere." The words might have sounded proud in another voice. Here they trembled. I walked back to the window, the skyline of Los Angeles stretching out beneath us, the glass catching the last hints of sun. "What do you want, Mother?" She hesitated by the doorway, as if unsure whether to step closer. "I'm not here to defend myself. I'm not here to talk about your father either." "Then what are you here for?" Her voice wavered. "To say I was wrong." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The hum of the city filtered through the glass. I didn't move. I didn't invite her to sit. She took a breath. "I should have stopped him that night. I should have opened the door when you knocked. But I was afraid, Madison. Your father had a way of making silence feel like safety, and I mistook fear for loyalty." She set the envelope on my desk. "You don't have to forgive me. Just read it." When she turned to leave, I almost called out, but the words caught behind my teeth. The door clicked softly behind her, leaving the faint scent of her perfume, the same one she wore when I was a child. I waited a long time before I opened the letter. The handwriting was neat but shaky. "My dearest Madison, if you are reading this, it means I've finally done what I should have done years ago, faced you without hiding behind him. You were right to leave. I see that now. I used to think strength meant standing beside your husband even when he was wrong. But real strength is standing beside what's right, even when you're alone. I remember the night you left. You knocked on my door. I sat on the other side listening to you cry, begging me to say something. I told myself staying silent would protect you from his anger. I see now that it only protected him from facing himself. When the door closed, I cried too, but quietly, because I thought mothers weren't allowed to fall apart. If I could go back, I would open that door. I would tell you to run, and I'd run with you. I can't change what I did, but I can tell you this. I have lived every day since with the sound of that door closing. Love, Mom." The ink blurred at the bottom, smudged by what looked like tears. I folded the letter carefully, my fingers tracing the edge of the page like it might disappear if I blinked too long. Outside, the sun had dropped below the skyline, leaving streaks of red and gold. I pressed my palm against the glass, the city lights flickering like small promises in the dark. Some apologies come late, but at least they come. The wind picked up outside, brushing against the window. I could almost hear her voice again, soft and uncertain. "I hear you, Mom," I whispered. The gates of the old Hale estate creaked open as my car rolled up the drive. The house sat quiet against the gray horizon, its windows half-shuttered, its garden overgrown. Salt air drifted in from the Pacific, the smell of tide and time. 12 years had passed, but the place hadn't aged, only frozen. The same gravel crunch under the tires, the same wind twisting through the palm trees. I stepped out and walked toward the front door. It opened before I could knock. Richard Hale stood in the doorway, thinner, older, but unmistakable. The man, who once filled a room, now looked smaller, the power worn off him like old paint. He studied me for a long moment, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. So he said, voice rough, "You finally decided to come home." "This isn't home," I answered. He gave a short, bitter laugh and turned toward the living room. "Fair enough. Come in anyway." The house was the same. Dark wood, leather chairs, portraits of the family still staring from the walls. My younger self smiled down from one of them, caught mid-laugh, a girl who hadn't yet learned what silence could cost. The half-empty glass of whiskey on the side table looked like it had been sitting there for days. He lowered himself into the armchair by the window, where the ocean spread wide and relentless beyond the glass. "I wondered how long it would take," he said. "The reporters, the lawsuits, the investigations. They took everything I built. Congratulations. I stayed standing. I didn't take anything. You handed it all to pride and called it protection. He looked at me tired but defiant. You've won Madison. Isn't that what you wanted? No, I said. I just stopped losing. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of waves hitting rock. His shoulders sagged the smallest surrender. I used to think control was power, he murmured, that keeping everyone in their place meant safety. But it doesn't. Real power is losing everything and still being able to stand. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the folder. Documents stamped and signed the last of the financial ties between us. These finalize the transfer of your remaining shares. You don't owe me anything, and I don't owe you. He flipped through the pages, confusion flickering. You're giving it back. You're not taking a cent. I shook my head. I never wanted your money. I wanted peace. He laughed, then a dry, cracked sound. You sound like your mother. I take that as a compliment. He nodded slowly, setting the papers aside. Maybe she was right about you after all. We sat there for a while, two people who had built walls so high they forgot why they started. Outside, the tide rolled in steady and indifferent. When I finally stood to leave, he didn't stop me. As I reached the doorway, his voice came low, almost an afterthought. I'm sorry, Madison, for the noise, for the silence, for everything in between. I didn't turn around, so am I. The wind met me as I stepped outside, strong enough to pull at my hair. The afternoon light burned against the glass, spilling gold over the ocean. I paused at the edge of the driveway, watching the waves flash silver and white beneath the sun. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just stops the bleeding long enough to let the scar settle. As I walked back toward the car, the wind rose again, carrying the scent of salt and something lighter. Freedom, maybe. The house shrank in the rearview mirror until it was only a shadow against the water. For the first time in years, I didn't look back. A year later, the light in Dubai felt softer, as if the city itself had learned how to breathe. The grand hall of Aurora Sky Dome shimmered with glass and gold sunlight streaming through the dome and scattering across the marble floor. The event banners read Beyond Appearance. The name of the foundation Hale Global had launched to fund women-led startups around the world. It was strange to see my company's logo next to words like empowerment and renewal. For so long, Hale had meant something else entirely. I stood near the stage watching guests take their seats, executives, journalists, women who had built their own small empires from nothing but courage. Their laughter filled the hall like music. Somewhere in the back row, I spotted Eleanor Brooks, elegant as always, a silver scarf draped over her shoulders. When she caught my eye, she smiled the same quiet pride she'd shown the first day we reopened that desert motel years ago. She joined me near the steps before the ceremony began. You know, she said, leaning close, they're quiet now because they've realized they lost. But you won by being still. I smiled. I wasn't trying to win. That's why you did, she said simply, and walked off to greet the sponsors. Outside, a helicopter bearing the Hale Global insignia passed over the glass roof, its reflections splintering into beams of light that danced across the audience below. The same sound that once signaled confrontation now felt like closure. I slipped out onto the balcony away from the chatter and champagne. The city stretched before me, glowing in the midday sun. The towers rising like pillars out of sand. 12 years ago, I left in the rain. Today, I stood beneath a cloudless sky, and I didn't need anyone to witness it. The silence was enough. The event coordinator poked her head through the door. Ms. Hale, we're ready for you. I took one last look at the skyline before stepping back inside. The hall quieted as I approached the podium. Cameras blinked in the distance. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. When I started this journey, I thought success meant proving everyone wrong, but over time I learned that peace is louder than pride, and presence is stronger than revenge. A pause. The air thickened with stillness. You don't need revenge, I said softly. Just presence. When you show up, fully unapologetically, truth speaks for itself. Applause rose slowly at first, then spread like a wave. I caught sight of Jason clapping in the front row, Eleanor beside him, her eyes shining. Around them, faces of women I'd mentored, executives I'd once been told would never take me seriously. For a moment, all the noise, all the years, all the silence folded into one breath. The ceremony continued. Presentations, photographs, laughter. But it all felt distant, like the echo of a life I'd finally stepped out of. When it ended, I returned to the balcony. The light had shifted. Evening was approaching. The helicopter from earlier was a faint shadow now fading into the horizon. I stood there for a while, the wind lifting strands of my hair warm and gentle. I thought about my father, my mother, the girl I used to be, the one who left home with a suitcase and a promise. Somewhere in the distance, the sea met the desert endless and calm. If they ever underestimated you, let your peace be the thing that silences them. If they ever doubted you, let your existence remind them that you were never gone. I looked down at the courtyard below where guests were saying their goodbyes. Laughter carried upward on the breeze. For once, I didn't feel the need to move to speak to prove. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The sun dipped behind the skyline, and the last trace of light clung to the glass dome. I whispered to myself, almost smiling. The return doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be real. If you've ever been dismissed, doubted, or erased, remember, your quiet comeback can still shake the world. Stay with us because some stories of strength don't start with noise, they start with silence.